So this is the second of our nocturne. I'm Joan Harper. I'm the membership secretary for the Whistler Society. We're delighted to have everyone join us. And as I'd said before, if you, for the event, if you'll go to speaker view, I think that's the best way to view it. Stay on mute. I will call on each of you who've already submitted a question in advance. So Mr. Whistler will be taking questions that were submitted prior to the seance. And then if we have time, and I hope that we will open it up to questions from the audience. And so without further ado, I'll hand this over to the Whistler Society Chairman, Martin Riley. Martin.
Joan, thank you. Joan is our ringmaster for this evening, this seance, actually more like mission control. Her instructions are clear. Please follow them, simple as that. Okay, welcome to you all. A fine mix of regular members and new faces from afar. My role now is to call James Whistler from the other side. If it fails, it makes something of a mockery of the whole enterprise. I think it's traditional for all members of a seance to hold hands. This we can't do. But if each of you would grasp your own hands thus, we might effect a connection. Okay, I'm calling James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Are you there? James Abbott McNeill Whistler.
Yes, I'm here.
Are you there?
Who dares summon me from the great beyond?
Well,
Mr. Whistler.
Hello, hello. Hi, there are a lot of people here. What would you have with me?
Well, Mr. Whistler, we have gathered here to ask you to propose some questions to you. And if you'd be so kind to give us your answers, we'll be very appreciative. In fact, the first question is from Daniel Sutherland, who you may not know has devoted much of his career as a historian to the study of your life and art. And he has the honor of the first question. First of all, he was very impressed that you were agreeing to this seance. And he was just slightly amused that we're able to communicate this way with you. I am told, though, that you were fascinated by spiritualism during your own lifetime. Can you tell us how and why that began?
Oh, all right. Yeah, okay. It began at the home of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, in Cheney Walk. And that would have been around 1860. At the time, spiritualism was all the rage in the circles in which I traveled. Gabriel himself was not a great believer in the occult, but it amused him to have friends join him in late night table rapping, often fueled, I will confess, by wine and cigars. I joined in fun, hoping to contact past artists whom I admired, such as Rembrandt, Hogarth, Velasquez, Hokusai, thinking I might learn something of their secrets. I did reach a dead cousin once, but no artist. So in that respect, you have done far better than I ever did in the realm of spiritualism in contacting me. I kept trying for several years, in part because that's Jo Heffernan, she was a genuine soulmate, was a bit of a medium. Indeed, we held our own seances, first at our home in Queens Road and later in Lindsay Row. My brother Willie, too, he had what we called the Scotch second sight and was given to premonitions. He accompanied me sometimes to the seances at Rossetti's home, as did, believe it or not, Frederick Leyland, but I hope we are not going to spend much time talking about here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Whistler. Our next question comes from Victoria Bennett.
Hi, Mr. Whistler. Where are
Hello.
you? Unfortunately, I did want to ask about Frederick Leyland, and I wanted
I'm so disappointed.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask you why he paid Whistler in pounds, not guineas, for his decorations for the Peacock Room.
Well, why did he pay me in pounds and not guineas? Okay, well, let me explain that for you. You see, the thing is, why did the Liverpool Medici pay me in pounds? That was intended as an insult to me, but of course, it says much more about who he was than who I am. He preferred to keep all the guineas for himself. Professionals paid each other in guineas. Tradesmen were paid in pounds, as if I were ever a tradesman. The tradesman was, of course, Frederick Richards Leyland. He was a Liverpool ship owner. I allowed him to serve as my patron for a time. And in 1874, I was approached by Thomas Jekyll to help with some color choices for the dining room of Leyland's house at 49 Prince's Gate, where Leyland had hung my painting, La Princesse du Pays de la Porcelain. I saw an opportunity to do much more than consult on color choices, to create something truly remarkable, a harmony in blue and gold, which came to be known as the Peacock Room. And this has been hailed as one of the most iconic works of interior design and decoration of late 19th century Britain. I believe you can see it today in the Freer Gallery of the Smithsonian. And how did Leyland reward me for turning a room in his house into this temple to beauty? He refused to pay my fee of 2,000 guineas simply because we had not agreed upon a price up front. It is true that I never sought his approval of my designs and that I had painted over a panel of Spanish leather he had in the room. But any fool can see that the room was a masterpiece. Indeed, I just painted as I went on without design or sketch. Even the press, whom I invited to see it, could tell that it was a masterpiece, and they could appreciate the brilliance of that room. Leyland professed to be unhappy with it, but this may have been more to do with his greed than his taste. In the end, he paid me a mere 600 pounds in pounds rather than guineas. History has proved me right, of course. It generally has.
Thank you, Mr. Whistler. That was quite entertaining and revealing. Our next question is from Rodney Lockwood. He says he's amazed to appreciate your work to the extent that he did, and he realized that all the reproductions of your work understated their exquisite quality. To what extent is your painting underappreciated due to the challenge to accurately reproduce the subtleties of your painting, Mr. Whistler?
Well, thank you, Mr. Lockwood. Although I cannot hear you, I do appreciate that you seem to have some understanding of art. Perhaps you are an art teacher or a practicing painter yourself, and you will be aware of the effort and struggle that a true artist undertakes, not to mention the innate talent and, dare I say, genius that is required to fulfill true potential. It is far more than flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, as Mr. Ruskin found out. I strove throughout my working life to create atmospheres, subtlety, luminosity. Just look at my nocturnes. Anyone who has seen my original work will realize its exquisite quality. Those are your words, Mr. Lockwood, not mine, and I must acknowledge your artistic appreciation and judgment. Unfortunately, I have no control over poor reproductions, which may have undervalued particular subjects in the eyes of the passing public, but my oeuvre is my legacy, and all those who have seen my work face on face, as it were, will acknowledge my high standing in the pantheon of artistic gods. I am led to understand that reproduction methods have improved dramatically since my time. But if you have only seen my works reproduced in books, go to an exhibition and study my work with your own eyes. Remove the veil.
Wonderful. Again, thank you. Our next question comes from our own chairman, Martin Riley.
Thank you. Mr. Whistler, you have a reputation for losing friends under acrimonious circumstances, particularly the costly row with your patron Frederick Richards Leyland, and most famously with John Ruskin, which led to your bankruptcy. You were fortunate to be bailed out by the Fine Arts Society, who came to your rescue. Did you feel chastened after these events and adopt a more conciliatory attitude?
Did I adopt a more conciliatory attitude? Well, first of all, let me correct you on one point. I have never lost a friend. This is especially true in the cases of the men you mentioned. And I must say, it's a splendid example of how my legend, if I may now call it that, has inspired any number of fictions about my life. I never fell out with poor old Tom Jekyll, and certainly not with Gabriel and Will Rossetti. With Jekyll, I assume you are referring to the way in which I altered Leyland's dining room from Tom's original design. Well, yes, I did, as we discussed, but the result was the amazing Peacock Room. Poor Tom had experienced a complete mental breakdown while working for Leyland. And whose fault was that, one might ask? I rescued the situation, and what is more, I publicly shared the credit for my beautiful creation with Tom. As for the Rossettis, Will did disappoint me with his rather tepid defense of my work in testimony at the Ruskin trial, but he did afterwards speak on my behalf, and we remained cordial ever after. Gabriel did doubt the quality of my more adventurous work, such as The Falling Rocket, and I do believe that as his own reputation as a painter receded, that he grew a bit jealous of my success. He complained, for example, that my exquisite portrait of Mrs. Leyland was not a very good likeness, as though that mattered. But even he had to concede its graceful design, which was, of course, the whole point. I admit not seeing him after my return from Venice in 1880, but he had been quite ill even before I left. When he died in 1882, I failed to attend the funeral. But you must understand, I've always had a dread of death. I very nearly did not attend my mother's funeral. And I did stay away from my brother's interment, which poor Willie would have understood. Why, it was only on the strictest compulsion that I was forced to attend my own funeral. Even so, concerning Gabriel's passing, I did write a warm note of sympathy to Will to make amends. Now, as for Leyland and Ruskin, they are prime examples of what I meant earlier when I said that my most celebrated quarrels were about art. Both men had disparaged my art, and in the most offensive ways. Ruskin's libelous words, and remember, the court did declare them libelous, threatened my livelihood as well as my reputation. That was intolerable. I was grateful to the Fine Arts Society for funding my sojourn in Venice, but I more than repaid them with my resulting exhibitions. So was I chastened by the experience? For what reason? What error had I committed? I was the wronged party, which history bore out, and the experience with Leyland and Ruskin made me even more determined to stand by my principles and take the scalp of any Philistine who dared challenge me. Quite apart from the fact that the world I inhabited was a fiercely competitive one, my life would have had no meaning had I not followed my own creative instincts. Why do you suppose so many young artists flocked to me after my return from Venice, and especially after the success of my 10 o'clock lecture? They called me master and imitated me in all things. They cheered me for standing firm against the preachers, the professors, and the dilettantes who would have destroyed art and who knew nothing of beauty. They understood that I was a leader who would neither falter nor stumble in the defense of art.
Well, well, well. Our next question, and I will give it a bit of a preamble, comes from Mark Armstrong and Althea Turner. They have a question of personal interest, Mr. Whistler, related to the former owner of their home on Cheney Walk. Mark and Anthea, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
Mark unfortunately can't be here, but James, this is the home of Walter Greaves. I'm sitting in a sitting room that he would have sat in many times, and I believe you were a visitor here.
Oh, yes, how tremendous.
Many parties, many events took place in this house, and we actually have a feeling he's still here. We hear him moving around in various rooms late at night, and we've even had a séance, which has proved that he is here. So, what I would like to know, because as you probably know that unfortunately Walter died a pauper, and there was a breakdown in your relationship. And I would like to know what your interpretation is of the breakup of that friendship.
We seem to be abnormal.
And you know, the lights have just gone out. I haven't touched anything. The lights have just, my light has just gone out. It's never gone out ever in this house.
That must be Walter. He is probably trying to make contact with me. Pay no attention. I'll speak to him later. I'm very unconscionably rude of him to interrupt a perfectly nice event such as we are having here. Now, I do say we seem to be abnormally focused on my personal relationships and not my art, but I suppose that my art has stood the test of time and speaks for itself, but my relationships, you know, have been lost to the mysteries of the past. Now, I relished my friendship with the entire Graves family. How could I not? My mother too, when living with me in the mid-1860s, she embraced them. The Greaves boys, Walter and Henry, you know, they could be a nuisance. They were always hanging around the studio and asking for painting lessons, but they more than repaid the attention I gave them by rowing me on the river, you know, as their father had done Turner. And while I sketched, and they taught me the waterman's jerk, they introduced me to Cremone Gardens. They did me in the decoration of the Peacock Room. They even helped me paint and decorate number 2 Lindsay Row when I first moved there. It was amusing, yet flattering to see them copy me in dress and manner. I also enjoyed the company of their 2 sisters, Alice and Elizabeth, who occasionally served as artist models. I sometimes strolled around Cremone with the elder girl, Alice, or Tinny, we called her, and we did eventually drift apart, but not until after I got back from Venice in 1880. Inviting Walter, he was the more promising artist, to the White House prior to that. Why we separated, you know, this distance of time I cannot say, other than that my time was taken up with my art and my more promising followers. I never called them students. I don't think it was a matter of social class, because I've always gotten along with working with them. I also recall distinctly, as late as 1895, that I spoke kindly of them. I was working at Lyme Regis when my wife, Beatrice, wrote to me from London, and she was quite horrified to say that Walter and Henry had painted a mural for the interior walls of the Streatham Town Hall. And she said it was a screaming farce, a sort of hideous Whistlerian chaos. If you can imagine a hodgepodge of every image I had ever created, from Battersea Bridge to Henry Irving as Philip of Spain. I think Thomas Carlyle was in there, Japanese ladies, peacocks, the firewheel of Cremone, even patterns from my picture frames. Everything, it seems, but the portrait of my mother, which they dared not attempt. I understood her alarm and concern, but I realized the boys meant well. I wrote to them and I thanked them for the tribute. They were, after all, intelligent and good boys, and I remained fond of them. I knew nothing of Walter's later hardships, if they indeed occurred when I was still living. I like to think I could have helped, although I was myself all at sea after my Trixie died in 1896.
Can I just ask, could I just quickly ask, what was your opinion of Walter's art on its own? Let's put on one side the Streatham incident.
I would not place him in the pantheon. It would be churlish of me at this juncture to comment poorly on the lad, but yes, I do not think he would have been exhibited with the finest of fellows, such as myself and, Velasquez, although why Dragon Velasquez?
Thank you, Mr. Whistler. That was really entertaining. Our next question, and I'm afraid that I am going to be a rather harsh taskmaster because we have quite an awful lot of questions. So if you could hold your secondary questions till after we finish at the end, and then we'll open it up. Georgia Tuziari, are you with us?
I am. Hello, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. My goodness, I can't believe I'm meeting you again. It's been so long. I just
remember it well.
I just wanted to talk about Russia. You were there as a young boy in the 1840s. The Tsar Nicholas I, your father, engineer, building the railway between the St. Petersburg and Moscow, and you and your lovely mother and the Galernaya where you stayed, the beautiful expat community that you were part of. Wow, what a life you had as a boy. Do you remember much from your Russian years?
Yes, I remember something. I was only 9 when we took the journey to St. Petersburg. And as you mentioned, my father had been awarded a commission from Tsar Nicholas I to build a railroad from the capital to Moscow. It was a very important commission. He'd been chosen out of many other engineers. And if you can imagine the journey by steamer, coach, carriage, it was quite exciting for me as a young boy, but it was also perilous. On our way to Liverpool, our ship, the Acadia, rammed a bark. It was terrifying at first, but they managed to rescue the crew. And once they were safe on board, we had a chance to talk to them. And we felt like regular salts, and later boasted of our friendship with veteran seamen. But the greater tragedy took place on the last leg of the trip when we were going by steamer to Kronstadt. On the first night out, my little 2-year-old brother, Charlie, refused to have any dinner. And we thought it might just be seasickness, but he continued to get worse the next day. And I'm sad to say he was dead before dawn on the second day. Mother was beside herself with grief. And we'd also lost our youngest sibling, Kirky, to scarlet fever right after father left for Russia. I have no idea how mother broke the news about Charlie and Kirky to father. It took her some time to recover from the journey and the shock of losing 2 children so suddenly. But I digress. You asked about my memories of Russia. Well, I recall the beauty and the grandeur of St. Petersburg, and our home was in an exclusive part of the St. Petersburg on Galernaya Street. It was only about a block from the quay. I have a dim recollection of seeing the masterpieces at the Winter Palace. I recall something of the paintings and the lavish decor of the Catherine Palace. I don't know if you've been there. And then I remember attending the annual art exhibition at the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts. It's perhaps, it may not be surprising that I recall these visits to see art more than childhood friendships or escapades. You have to understand I've been drawing from the time I was 2 years old, and I was really interested in nothing else. I also remember receiving drawing lessons from an acquaintance of my father's, Alexander Koritsky, a student, and he was a later assistant to the well-known Russian artist Karl Buryulov. Unfortunately, I had a second bout of rheumatic fever in the summer of 1847, and that caused mother to take me out to the Isle of Wight to recuperate. When the railroad was completed in March 1848, my father was embraced and decorated by the Tsar, but our time in Russia was over.
Thank you, Georgia, and Mr. Whistler. Thank you. Next, we have Sarah from the Whistler Museum in Lowell. Sarah, are you with us?
First of all, I want to tell Mr. Whistler he's looking fabulous as ever. But here's my
thank you
question.
very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's the lock of hair, isn't it?
Yeah, oh, it's beautiful. Anyway,
Ladies love that.
your art passed through several phases and seemed indicative of various schools of art, from what was formerly known as realism through impressionism to symbolism. How do you explain this inconstancy?
Well, first of all, I would not say I ever belonged to any school of art. My art was always Whistlerian. And if you perceive changes over time, of course, they were the result of my constant search for perfection. To me, art was live. And, just as we all change in our habits and likes and dislikes over time, so too, I did in my search for an ever greater beauty. Some people called it art for art's sake. You may have heard that expression. I never used that phrase, but I shared its spirit. And I did borrow and learn from many great artists, including past ones, such as I tried to contact the spirit world, as I said, in many of my contemporaries, such as Courbet, Rossetti, Albert Moore. But I perfected whatever I took from them to create my own vision of art. I was an impressionist, if you want to use that phrase. For example, long before those Johnnies put together their first exhibition, Degas, whom I respected, asked me to join them. But why should I have done? I always wanted to be my own man. I did eventually exhibit on a limited scale with people like Monet, another thoroughly decent chap, but you must understand that we also thought of ourselves as being in competition with one another, especially in our early careers. And you could call it hubris or conceit on my part, but I simply could not sacrifice my own theories and principles for the sake of some amorphous, not to say suffocating school. All you need to understand about me is my absolute devotion to perfection in art, that elusive search for beauty. Nothing else mattered to me. Not friends, not family, not position. I'm somewhat ashamed to acknowledge it even now, but that is who I was.
We next up have Diana Bartley.
My question is, another part of your public image was that of, dare I say it, a dandy. Did you think of yourself in that way?
Dandy? I certainly did not think of myself in that way, I tell you. In fact, I would say that you will find only my enemies and people who did not understand the meaning of the word described me as a dandy. I will admit to being a poser on occasion when it was in my interest to gain public attention. There were, for instance, the yellow socks and the lapel flower I wore for my 1883 exhibition, and my famous wand, though in fact I used that sparingly and for a limited time. Oh, and I suppose there's the monocle. Yes, but you see, my eyesight is wretched. Otherwise, I believe you will find that once I'd moved to London and began seeking commissions and, the friendship of influential people, I dressed as a gentleman. Look at the photographs of me. Do you see a dandy? No, it's only in the caricatures and the cartoons that some ill-informed persons would portray me as a dandy. I suppose the most notorious instance was that wretched portrait of me by William Chase, but I told him at the time that I was putting him on. And when it was finished, I asked him not to exhibit it. When he ignored me, I broke with him. Another quarrel over art, but can you blame me? I've also been called a flaneur, to which I plead guilty, but that is not, or need not be, the same thing as a dandy. Just as my mother and father taught me to lead an honorable life, so they taught me to dress as a gentleman. And look at the portraits of my father, an army officer. Now there was a model in dress and appearance and bearing. My only real affectation was my hair, especially my white plume. But can you blame me? Women love my hair.
And I think they still do. Next question, and thank you for that, Diana, is from Michael Biscoe. Are you with us, Mr. Biscoe?
My question is very simple. Why did you sign your paintings with a butterfly?
Ah, the butterfly signature you're asking about. Excellent. Okay, well, I can tell you my art was unique and my signature was the same. You know, it always seemed out of kilter to affix a crude batch of letters to a work of visual beauty. You know, I was perhaps inspired a bit in this by the symbol that was used by my friend Albert Moore. And so I first began using a butterfly, formed, as you may know, by my initials in variations in flesh color and green, the balcony. Eventually, I used it to sign my correspondence as well. But bear in mind that the butterfly evolved. Eventually, it developed a sting in its tail. And this took place after I was cheated by Leyland out of my proper respect and compensation for the Peacock Room. And after I married Beatrix Goodwin, it alighted on a trefoil that resembled her maiden initials, BP. And some people have even said that the butterfly reflects my the journalist and art critic Marion Henry Spillman commented, I'm going to read this if I may. She said, "Dear Whistler, the airy, happy thing you are, the butterfly basking in the sunshine of life, flitting daintily and jauntily about for very joy, and stinging for very malice. Of course, I did not sting for malice. I stung only when provoked."
No, well noted.
Thank you.
And thank you for that, Michael. Our next question comes from David Waddell. David, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Mr. Whistler, first of all, I noted you're in black tie. If we'd been warned, I would have put something more appropriate on for you.
I would have
humor you.
so. I'm a bit shocked at the garb that some of you thought appropriate to convene with me tonight, but I shall let that pass.
Could it, the Cheney Walk Trust is, you know, a lot of us live in Cheney Walk, where you had several houses. And in particular, you spent 10 years in 101, I think. And during that time, painted many of your nocturnes. And we just wondered, they were probably your most famous or most memorable paintings. What exactly inspired those? Was there anything in particular that led you to paint in that style?
That's a complex story, but it's a good example of my evolution and constant search for perfection in art. And actually, the idea first came to me in Valparaiso, where you may know I found myself in 1866. That was the result of my brother Willie having dragged me into a half-baked idea to make our fortunes by supplying arms to the Chilean military, if you can believe such a thing. In any event, the lighting effects at that latitude, it was only 33 degrees. It was far below what I'd known in Britain and Europe. Well, unlike any I had known, I discovered a distinctly luminous tone in the dusk and twilight, which is apparently most evident in summer and autumn. And the skies were streaked with color. They're called crepuscular rays, as the fading sunlight streamed through gaps in the clouds. And those images remained with me when I returned to London. And I searched the English skies at sunset and dusk for similar traces of color. I found them, but because of the wretched smoke and haze of London, they were darker in tone. And still, I discovered that by manipulating my color schemes, I could produce quite sensational tonal patterns. And I attempted the same in other parts of England and Venice with mixed results. I also turned out several pastels, etchings, and lithographs as nocturnes, but my favorites remain those paintings of the Thames done in the 1870s. The very nature of the work also suited my determination to eliminate any storytelling from my work. Some people find expressive moods and poetry in the nocturnes, which is all well and good, but no storytelling, please. I gave up the painted nocturnes in the 1890s. My once lovely London skies, turned black. I suppose that was the result of increased industrial smoke and appalling fog. The changed atmosphere played the devil with my health too, and I certainly hope it has improved since then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. So this brings us to Sandra Higgins. Sandra, are you there?
Yes, I am. Here I am. Sorry, I unmute that.
Oh,
Hello, Mr. Whistler. You look splendid, absolutely splendid.
thank
I
you.
must
So
say.
do you. I
Yes.
enjoy the color of your hair.
Oh, thank you. You could paint me sometime. I understand you had a school in Paris around 1898. Were you a good teacher? Where was it located? And what was it called?
Yes, well, let me tell you about that studio. I'm so glad that you brought up my academy. It was the Academy Common, which I founded in 1898, and it was in a large house and stable at, the address was number 6 Passage Stanislas. It was near the Rue Notre Dame de Champs. And was I a good teacher, you say? I suppose I've had some criticism regarding the way that I ran the academy, and that could account for its short existence, as it only lasted for 3 years. What it was some of the male students complained that I paid more attention to the women's class. Really, I find it amusing that these so-called men should complain that no one paid enough attention to them. The women simply had more promise. Some of the students also complained that I was too harsh in my appraisals of their work. They appeared to need more mollycoddling than I was prepared to give them. However, I was merely trying to prepare them for the harshest critic of all, the art market. One of my students went so far as to write on a wall of the men's studio, and I still remember this. I bought a palette just like his colors and his brush. The devil of it is, you see, I did not buy his touch. Well, perhaps the poor quality of his rhyme tells you all you need to know about his talents. Eventually, I simply didn't have the interest in this experiment to continue it, especially once we had so few students enrolling. I had much to teach, but few students worthy of the teacher.
Thank you, Sandra. Sheila Foley, are you with us?
I am.
Please go ahead.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. And I am also from Massachusetts, Mr. Whistler.
Excellent.
I know you don't always like being mentioned as being from Lowell, but that's aside from the
Lowell,
point.
you say? I dimly recall a place called Lowell. I didn't choose to be born there, you understand.
Yes, I understand that. So anyway, my question is, and I hesitate to ask this after all the questions about your various rows, but this one was a more personal family matter. And I have heard a lot about your falling out with Seymour Hayden.
Oh.
And I'm wondering if you can tell us the truth about that, please.
Well, I always tell the truth about everything, which is probably why I get in so much trouble. Okay. Well, do you know your Charles Dickens? I used to call Hayden a pecksniff. He was a humbug and a duplicitous hypocrite. And to think, you know, as a young man, I idolized him. I actually dedicated my first published set of etchings to him. Mon vieux ami, ha! Then he betrayed me and the ones I loved. And this is the truth of the matter. First, he presumed to be an artist, an etcher of the same stature as me. And more despicable yet, he refused to treat Jo, that's Jo Heffernan, with the respect that she deserved. His scruples, he said, prohibited him from dining with us in Lindsay Row. Scruples over what? That she was Irish, a Catholic, that we were living together? When I called him out, he barred both me and my mother from his house. And this is the home of my sister and her daughter. I always felt sorry for my sister, Deborah. She had to live under his tyrannical rule for so many years. And further, he abused his medical partner and my friend, Jim Traer, because Jim had a weakness for drink. I shoved Mr. Pecksniff through a cafe window in Paris for that offense, and I wish you had seen it, you would have applauded me. He retaliated by scheming to have me expelled from the Burlington Fine Arts Club. Not that I cared what that band of Philistines thought of me, but I exposed him in my little pamphlet, The Parker Papers. Have you read it? It's a collector's item. It's one of my finest literary efforts. I've heard it said that Hayden and I simply had incompatible temperaments. The heat of his temper clashing with my cussedness. God save the mock. Who was it who said, you can judge a man by his enemies?
Well, thank you for that one, Sheila. And thank you again, Mr. Whistler. We are going on to Stephen Bartley. Stephen, I know you're there.
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
I'm sorry we're not sharing a glass of champagne at our mutual club, the Chelsea Arts Club, but I raise my glass to you. My question is, I know you're very particular about where your paintings ended up. You might like to know that some of your paintings, finest paintings, are in the collection of Tate Britain, as opposed to the National Gallery, where the donors, who include your friend Peter Studd, intended them to be. Now that 100 years have passed, are you at last prepared to be considered a British artist? If not, what would you like the Whistler Society to do about it?
Well, frankly, I fail to see how the passage of even so long a period as a century could inflict upon me a nationality. I was and still am a citoyen du monde. I was born American. I was schooled in Russia, in England, in France. I worked all over Europe. My art belongs to the world. And I'm not sure what the Whistler Society, with all its considerable clout, could do about that. In fact, there are times that I resented the way I was treated by the English, which is why I made it clear to everyone that I wish that none of my work ever found a place in an English gallery. Perhaps you consider that it is my techniques that would place me amongst the British artists, but remember that my art is first and foremost sui generis. I did work in watercolor in the 1870s, and this was what the British were doing at the time. Still, I managed to take this to a higher level, and I reversed my oil painting technique and diluted my oils to the consistency of the watercolor. And that's perhaps why the English envied me. They even fought against me in court, the Ruskinians and the Royal Academicians. Hypocrites, making me feel as I never belonged there. And I was at the time the president of the Society of British Artists. Can you imagine? I do think, looking back, that mine was a genius technique, but you would not be wrong to say that my nocturnes were influenced by the English or British or whatever you want to call them. Did I get praise from the Royal Academy? No. As to whether the Tate Gallery or the National Gallery is a more appropriate place for my paintings, I rely on the Whistler Society to use it out to ensure that my masterpieces are displayed in whichever of those two is more modern a museum and less one of your mausoleums.
Thank you very much. Very well answered.
Very well put. Thank you, Stephen. We are next on to Clive Jennings. Clive, I saw you here.
Yes. Good evening, Mr. Whistler. How are you?
Good evening.
I'm very sorry to have to return to this thing of your famous spats with various people, but what is your opinion of Oscar Wilde? I mean, there are delightfully amusing stories about the pair of you, but again, you appear to have fallen out. And why?
Well, we certainly did, and let me tell you exactly why. Now, I did like Oscar. I believe he looked up to me. I enjoyed our verbal sparring. You know, it made for good press, and it enhanced our public images. Even, some of our encounters were either much exaggerated or outright fabricated in the press. The problems came when Oscar began stealing my ideas and theories about art and presenting them as his own. He even gave paid lectures based on my ideas. And Oscar, you have to understand, had no feeling at all for art, only fashion. You know, that said, I never wished him ill. All that business about the trial and his imprisonment, well, that was terrible. I saw him once in Paris after his release from prison, but we passed each other without speaking. Perhaps both of us were just too embarrassed to speak.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clive. George McDaniel, are you with us? Well, I do happen to know what George was going to ask. He wanted to have some more information about your trip to Chile in 1866 and what its real purpose was.
Oh, the real purpose of my trip to Chile. Well, I suppose I can tell the truth now, although it might bring a slight blush of embarrassment to my cheeks, because I had told the Pinnells, they were rather gullible, that I had been approached by some ex-Confederates from the War of Southern Independence. You may have heard it called the Civil War, but I assure you it was anything but. And they wanted me, these Confederates, as a West Point man, to join them in helping Chile win its independence from Spain, a sort of adventure. And, you know, that was partly true, but really it was my brother Willie who knew some of these men because he had served as a surgeon in the army of Robert E. Lee. And he brought me into the scheme. And our object was not adventure as much as profit. We were to transport to Chile and sell to the Chilean government naval torpedoes and torpedo boats to sink the Spanish ships that threatened Valparaiso. And I was hard up for money at the time. And I stood to earn a nice share of our 60,000 pound commission. And I went ahead of the rest of the party to serve as a scout and spy on the Spanish, but the whole thing was a bust. It took so long for the weapons to arrive that the war had all but ended, and the Spanish had sailed home after demolishing a good part of Valparaiso. I must say that while I received no payment, I should say, other than for my expenses, I started some nice paintings during my 6th month there, and I developed the idea for my nocturnes while painting the glorious twilight of that hemisphere as I discussed earlier. So while Chile benefited little from my visit, the world of art benefited to no small degree.
Thank you for that truthfulness. And our next question is from Daniel Sutherland. Well, again, I do happen to know what Dan was looking to ask you. And it's quite a simple question, actually. In life, when were you happiest? And what do you miss most about the realm of the living?
When was I happiest? That's hard to say. You know, I had an idyllic childhood, except for my bouts with rheumatic fever and those dreary days after father died. I believe one of my cousins, Emma Palmer, said that Willie and I were raised like little princes. That was a bit exaggerated, but I do recall wonderful days, especially when living at Stonington, Connecticut, and in St. Petersburg, as I talked about earlier. I have fond memories of my days at West Point, too, despite my dismissal. My fellow cadets were first-rate fellows, and I had my first sexual experiences there with the local girls. Unfortunately, I simply lacked the discipline to suit the Army, and I admit to having a reckless nature and a tendency to rebel against authority. My student days in Paris were incomparable. I would have remained there if I thought I had a fair chance of succeeding there as an artist. My early days in London, though, they had their compensations. I met Joe and Rossetti and Swinburne and Du Maurier, so many others. I was a bit at 6s and 7s following the Chilean fiasco, but Maud saved me, and the satisfaction I felt from the early and mid 1870s, perhaps my most productive years, artistically speaking, should be evident. Of course, then the Peacock Room affair turned out badly, as did my whole association with the Leyland clan, and then followed by the Ruskin trial, my bankruptcy and exile in Venice. But I emerged rejuvenated, the butterfly rampant, one might say, and never looked back. I admit to having occasional doubts and depressed moments along the way, especially when I felt as though I was not progressing in my art. But Trixie, that is my wife, Beatrice, whom I married in 1888, she became my anchor, my rock, my chinky, as I called her, until she died in 1896. And you might say that those are my last truly happy days. As to what I missed most about the material world, I must say it's my inability ever again to create beautiful things.
Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts and memories. We have come to the conclusion of the submitted questions. And so we would like to open it up to questions about current events, not Mr. Whistler's past, but something that is au courant. And if you will use either the chat feature or the reaction button to raise your hand to ask a question, I'll call on you. And I believe we have the first question from Fiona Mann. Fiona, can you unmute to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Whistler. My question, I'd like to ask you what you thought of Darren Waterston's reimagining of the Peacock Room, the Filthy Lucre, at the V&A last year.
That's an excellent question. Well, first of all, I would say that I expect a man to do his own work. I do take it in the spirit of an homage, and I appreciate it at that level. I think it must have been wonderful for people to see a new version of something that I had labored over. And I think especially pleasant to me is the idea that more than 100 years later, people are still finding out about how horrific the gold scab treated me. And if there's one more modern opportunity to grind his own diminishing and perhaps now invisible reputation into the dust, then I'm all for it.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
The next question is from Martin.
I did see his question. He and I were students many, many years ago, and we studied the rules of creation of perspective. And he asked if there are any mechanical devices used by Whistler to create that structure. And I seem to recollect that one of the greatest proponents of that art was Piet Mondrian. And it prompted what came to be known as the Piet Mondrian question. Did he use a ruler? At first sight, the work of modernist Mondrian is fundamentally different to that of Whistler. Stark geometric elements in the former and loose atmospheric imagery in the latter. However, some of Whistler's paintings and prints, his boats in particular, show great clarity of line and fine, precise draftsmanship. Mr. Whistler, would you please enlighten us? Did you use set squares and dividers and compasses, and did you use a ruler?
I may have used a ruler on occasion, but I can assure you I was no slave to compasses or abacuses or any other complicated technical means to divide out my art. I used my eyes and my brain and my heart, and I strove to represent the feeling of what I saw as much as the particulars of it. Quite different from a Mr. Mondrian, who appears to have sort of predated the Sudoku by several days.
Very well put. Very well put.
I'm afraid that we are out of time, and I quite fear that we may be.
Oh, I feel myself fading.
Yes, I'm afraid we might be losing the connection. And yes,
Oh dear.
I'm afraid he's gone.
Okay.
Martin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Joan, thank you so much. What a remarkable evening, both virtual and surreal. Thank you all for taking part. And I must record particular thanks to Dan Sutherland, whose enthusiasm and insight helped us through some very choppy waters. Georgia Tutsiari, Paulina Aktabianken, and Devon Cox also contributed hugely to the information that was put out by the remarkable Darcy Sullivan. Obviously, without him, it would have been a pretty poor effort. Darcy, I don't know if you can still hear us, but thank you. At the risk of sounding corny, an Oscar-winning performance. A veritable tour de force, and it's a delight to see that you've managed to get Whistler to overcome his desperate self-doubt over the years. And finally, to our ringmaster, Joan, quite extraordinary, a remarkable production. I know it's taken many, many hours in the making, and if everybody had been as diligent as you, it would have been utterly faultless. Some just didn't turn up, and that's how life is. So, to Mr. Whistler, we say farewell, and let's hope it's au revoir. And as he must, if not now, has gone back to the other side. Thank you all so much, and good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.